Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar addressing the changing needs of biopharma clinical trials and sponsored testing programs with telegenetics, how virtual genetic services accelerates program reach, enrollment, engagement, and continuity. We're excited you could join us. My name is Megan Billingsley, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today, we are going to deep dive on how many biopharma organizations have turned to telegenetics to support clinical trial enrollment, engagement, and speed time to market. As they work to find and engage more people to enroll in studies, they're operating in a changing landscape as trials become more decentralized and scientifically advanced. With value-added services such as genetic testing and counseling built into study protocols, biopharma companies not only benefit from knowing who qualifies for trials, but they also deepen their knowledge of the patient population and the genetic landscape for their therapeutics. Joining us are our speakers from Genome Medical as they walk through these trends, discussing the role of telegenetics and how to build it into your research programs. We're thrilled to be joined by our speakers, Molly McGinnis, Senior Director, Client and Partner Relations, and Michelle Hearn, Clinical Science Liaison. Before we get started, though, I have just a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right corner of your presentation window. If you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed, or if we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know we do capture all questions. And now I'll hand it over to Molly to get us started.
All right, thank you for that lovely introduction. We're excited to be here and share a bit more about what we do at Genome Medical and how we can support our biopharma partners and research organizations looking to enroll in clinical trials and promote access to new, exciting, emerging on-market therapeutics. So just a little bit of a landscape for today. We'll jump into providing an overview of kind of how genomics is now being used in drug discovery and development. Then talk specifically about the unique value that genetic counseling can play in patient access to testing and therapeutic opportunities. And then we'll dive into some really compelling case studies, really showing our experience with offering telegenetic support for biopharma companies, specifically related to sponsored genetic testing programs. And then we'll end with talking a little bit about the best practices that we've learned in terms of incorporating genomic services. So what are our objectives today? I think if you leave this discussion, the importance is really thinking about these two main areas. One is the fact that genomics is playing an increasingly critical role in shortening the diagnostic odyssey for patients, but also expanding access to disease-specific therapeutics for patients and families. And two is really around how telegenetics services can provide a really unique aspect to accelerated access and equitable inclusion for patients, not only for clinical trial opportunities, but also to on-market and approved therapeutics. So where do we want to start? I think it's always important to really start and talk about the patient journey. When we think about patients really searching for a genetic diagnosis, this can be not only specific to patients and families with a rare, undiagnosed genetic disorder, but also patients who potentially have a new diagnosis of cancer, and there could be a suggestion that there could be a hereditary component. Regardless of what those first symptoms are that present, we know that patients really are often on this winding road to finding a diagnosis and eventually getting connected to a patient support community and ultimately to management and treatment recommendations. And this journey can unfortunately last months to years for many of these patient communities. And so we've seen with the advent and increased utilization of genetic testing, especially with expanded genetic test panels and more agnostic testing approaches like access to whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing, we've fortunately been able to see patients and families shorten this diagnostic odyssey, really shorten the time from first symptoms present to the diagnosis. But ultimately, identifying a genetic diagnosis is really just step one in this ongoing therapeutic odyssey that patients and families face. They want to get access to new treatment and management recommendations. And ultimately, the goal is to improve health outcomes. And it's been exciting to see over the last couple of years how genomics has really helped shorten this odyssey for patients and families. Not only does this really impact the patient experience, but we see that increasing utilization of genomics within the drug development pathway is really accelerating therapeutic development. So not only do we better understand underlying disease mechanisms, but we're able to identify, validate, discover, and prioritize new drug targets. Biomarker discovery, and then the development of companion diagnostics. And then the use of genomics, as you will see us here talk about some of these case studies, we can help refine patient selection and trial design. And then lastly, we've also seen a really unique use of pharmacogenomics in the drug development pipeline that helps inform efficacy outcomes and safety signals. So not only do we see this increasing use of genomics really impact the patients and families for the better, but also really impact and accelerate the overall drug development pipeline. So what does this mean? This means really an explosion of new therapeutic opportunities for patients where there's significant unmet need. When we specifically think about the rare disease community, we know that there's over 7,000 rare diseases known to date. And of those 7,000 rare diseases, less than 10% actually have an FDA-approved therapeutics. And over the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion in cell and gene therapy products that has really proved to be quite promising for these disease communities. So these headlines really just show a minority of the exciting announcements over the last couple of years for conditions that historically have never had any treatments available. So conditions like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, sickle cell disease, ALS, and even Huntington's disease. And so this is a really exciting time for patients, for pharmaceutical companies, and the goal is for us to understand how do we best get access to these patients for these new opportunities. And so what this means is even more critical is patient identification, recruitment, and engagement is a real critical element of success. So this really shows a very simplistic pipeline for clinical trial development, really showing kind of the various phases from discovery, clinical trial phase 1, 2, and 3 up to FDA approval. And we know that really recruiting and identifying patients is a critical component to making sure this pipeline moves as appropriate. And this shows an example of kind of the general numbers of patients that may be needed for a clinical trial. But we know for conditions where they're rare or ultra rare conditions, these patient numbers can be even smaller. And so it's essentially finding a needle in a haystack for these patients. And we know based on our experience and kind of some best practices that access to genetic counseling can become a pivotal critical point for access to genetic testing and discussion with patients on clinical trial opportunities. So I'm going to pass this over to Michelle to really provide more of an example of genetic counseling, who genetic counselors are, what we do, and how we can really play a critical role in access to patients.
Thank you, Molly. So I am a genetic counselor by training, which my title may not entirely reflect. And what I want to start with is a bit of a lens of what is genetic counseling and what do patients get out of it as a way of demonstrating the unique value that this service can bring. So I worked in direct patient facing care for over 15 years. And in that time, I had the chance to see and hear firsthand the unique and valued outcomes that patients received through the process of genetic counseling. Now, in my current role, working with partners to build and run genetic counseling partnerships, what I often hear is that most people have very little, if any, understanding of what goes on in a genetic counseling appointment and what the patients get out of it. And this makes sense because many people, even in my personal social life, have never had a chance to meet with a genetic counselor. either because they haven't had a medical reason, or what we're hearing more and more is that they are either unaware that genetic counseling is even a service. And unfortunately, we also hear that there are logistic barriers as far as location, insurance coverage limitations, and just a general lack of knowledge of what genetic counseling is and how it can be accessed. So if any of those things resonate to this audience, what I'm hoping is to kind of peel back the curtain and offer you some deep insights about genetic counseling. So we'll start with just an understanding of what is genetic counseling. Genetic counseling is a process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. And at the heart of this process is a relationship between the patient and the genetic counselor. Each session starts with the genetic counselor listening, building rapport, and asking questions to really understand where the patient is in their journey. And then the process is moved along through a unique combination of education and counseling skills. So the process of genetic counseling has a few tenets, including that understanding genetic information, which is delivered via education, is key. And in addition to that, recognizing the individual attributes of each patient, including resiliency, that their emotions matter, and supporting their individual autonomy and decision-making, we blend those things to support patients in decision-making, in adapting, and in making management choices based on their specific situation. And so what is, I think, quite unique about genetic counseling is that this process is flexible and a genetic counselor works to adapt it for each individual situation. So in the situation of a patient who's newly diagnosed with a genetic condition, if they have a lot of emotions, there may be very little education because we would recognize that the patient probably isn't able to absorb any specific detailed genetic concepts. On the other end of the spectrum, I've seen patients who were extremely sophisticated as far as wanting to understand detailed molecular mechanisms. And for those individuals, the education might be much more detailed. In every single session, the genetic counselor is also using a really special set of counseling skills to validate the patient's feelings, to kind of help them recognize what some of the challenges are and support them in navigating conversations that may need to happen with family members and medical providers. So who are these genetic counselors that deliver this, that support this process with the patient? Well, genetic counselors are, I think, a really unique blend. They have expertise in communicating complex information in patient-friendly terms that is tailored to each patient's health literacy level. So I think of genetic counselors as a combination of genetic experts, counselors, educators, and scientists. We understand at a very deep level the genetics and the science of each genetic disorder, and we leverage short-term counseling interventions and education strategies to help work the patient through the process of genetic counseling. So what happens in a genetic counseling session? Well, there are many things that happen. What I also want to recognize is the things that we've included here, these are what a genetic counselor does. I actually would guess that many patients don't realize that all these things are happening, but the genetic counselors are trained to navigate this conversation in an effortless way to include many different components. So in a session, a genetic counselor is often assessing the risk based on medical and family history, recommending genetic testing if that's appropriate, educating about the type of test, the type of results, what those results would mean with regard to implications for management, for the individual patient, as well as their reproductive risk and implications for family members' risks. And throughout all of that, the genetic counselor is providing individualized counseling to help support informed decision-making and adaptation. So listening to what the patient is saying and helping to validate and normalize and reflect back what they're hearing from the patient as a way of helping them move through the process. In addition, often a genetic counselor is going to offer support, resources, including discussion of advocacy, research opportunities, clinical trial options, et cetera. So that's a little bit of kind of the genetic counselor lens of our services. And I want to now sort of switch to look at it from another angle and share some things that come from patients or the patient experience. So we have the benefit of some very wonderful people offering their thoughts and quotes. These are patients that we have seen. So, for example, one patient said, "My counselor spoke clearly in understandable language, eliciting my thoughts with empathy." From another person, we heard, the genetic counselor was the perfect person to talk to about an emotionally challenging and painful topic. Someone else said, my genetic counselor was extremely knowledgeable and made sure I understood each step in the process. And finally, we also received this comment that I understood the outcome and I felt heard and validated in my responses. And these quotes are actually similar to feedback that I have received over the course of my career in working with patients. So, I get goosebumps every time I read them. What I'm also pleased to share is that now we have a growing body of literature that really supports the benefit and the impact of genetic counseling in a more formal way, rather than just anecdotally through patient feedback from surveys. And so what we're seeing in the literature is that genetic counseling has benefits both with regard to medical elements, as far as more accurate and thorough family histories, more patients accessing guideline appropriate genetic testing, a greater adherence to management recommendations, as well as fewer inappropriate genetic tests being ordered and less misuse or misunderstanding of genetic test results for a patient. As far as psychological benefits, we're also starting to see more informed decision regarding genetic testing, patients having greater empowerment, as well as greater satisfaction and engagement, and lower distress and disease-specific anxiety. As with many specialties in the medical field, genetic counseling was historically delivered in person. And even before the pandemic, I think there was a shift towards increasingly providing genetic counseling using telemedicine because of some of the geographic disparity distributions that we'll talk about. Of course, the last 5 years or so, particularly spurred by the COVID pandemic, has really increased the literature showing that there's equivalent patient understanding and benefit of genetic counseling delivered virtually using telegenetics compared to in-person care. And I think this is a very welcome set of literature because it really shows how, telegenetics can support the needs, particularly in the biopharma space. And I think this is what Molly and myself and the rest of our team at Genome Medical has started to see as well in the programs that we collaborate with. So virtual care delivers equitable access to care, particularly in smaller areas, more rural, anything outside of a metropolitan area. We see confirmed diagnostic efficacy compared to traditional in-person evaluations. Of course, we have this sort of more obvious things of convenience and reduced travel burden, cost effectiveness, often faster answers because of decreased wait times. And fortunately, we're continuing to see high satisfaction and acceptability, both among patients and healthcare providers. And I think all of these things really funnel in to provide further rationale for enabling decentralized trials using telegenetics. And So now that really leads well into thinking about what we at Genome Medical can do to help expand program access and accelerate patient enrollment with telegenetics. So we'll focus a little bit more on our organization. Our vision at Genome Medical is to bring genomic medicine to everyday care. And we do this kind of thinking about two pillars that we stand on. One is efficient and innovative technology solutions to support the patient journey, including patient engagement and care navigation. And that is an important support for our large network of clinical genomics expertise spanning the entire country. So if you look at our team, we are the largest US provider of telehealth genetic services with over 95 clinicians on staff with at least 10 or more, average of 10 or more years of experience for each clinician. We cover more than 175 million lives, across all 50 states. And when we dial down to the clinical areas of expertise, we actually have a lot of breadth and depth across our team, including significant experience in oncology, reproductive health, cardiovascular heart disease, neurology, pediatric conditions, rare disease, as well as proactive or population genomics and pharmacogenomics. So this breadth and depth allows us to offer a full suite of services for our partners. The core of that is often the genetic counseling services. So we have a large team of genetic counselors with lots of experience delivering telehealth counseling sessions and clinical deep knowledge in rare disease areas as well as oncology. In addition, we have technology tools that support risk assessment and education to identify and educate patients who may benefit from genetic counseling services and testing. We have test review and authorization opportunities to ensure that patients get the appropriate test and assistance with ordering when appropriate. And then we have our genetic advisory services team that is able to consult and support in developing and launching individual precision health programs really tailored to the needs of particular goals and programs. Oops, excuse me. When we think about our expertise across rare disease, we have I'll be sharing with you a lot about sponsored genetic testing and counseling programs. And to date, we have supported programs across a wide range of clinical areas, including musculoskeletal conditions, neurologic disorders, immunodeficiency, cardiovascular conditions, hearing and vision conditions, hereditary cancer syndromes, hemoglobinopathies, and multiple congenital anomalies. So this experience can be leveraged in building new programs to really bring in our past learnings and continue to evolve the services as the science evolves as well. When we think about sponsored genetic counseling, I wanted to share with you our model for how we like to deliver this services. And it really puts the patient and the provider at the center. So typically this involves a program sponsor that is the biopharmaceutical company, and then a lab of their choice. So at Genome Medical, we're lab agnostic, and we have experience working with all of the major genetic testing labs. We recognize that for an individual program, it's important for the partner and the program sponsor to have autonomy and control over what the genetic testing lab is and what the test offerings are. So we're really here to collaborate and partner with both the program sponsor and the lab to create a program that's going to support the patient and the provider. And we will come in to deliver the genetic counseling services as needed, depending on the unique needs of each individual program. When we think about the value that sponsored genetic testing and counseling brings, what we're really seeing is that these services increase access to testing and counseling, particularly in community settings or in areas that are far from academic or research institutions. And this allows increased support for physicians, especially in specialties where historically genetic testing may not really have been available. Perhaps there was little understanding of what the genetic basis was, and therefore the specialists in those areas really wouldn't have had a reason until recently to order a genetic testing. So we're kind of creating a safety net for them to ensure that their patients are getting comprehensive genetic counseling services. And this we know can increase diagnosis of patients with rare genetic conditions, as well as support testing of relatives, or what we call cascade testing, including variant resolution and family member at-risk identification. And all of these things then lead to identifying more patients who are candidates for a specific treatment or trial, and really can kind of reach deeper across the country for patients who are under-recognized or underdiagnosed. So now I'll turn it back over to Molly.
Thanks, Michelle. So we'll kind of continue to dive into a little bit of the utility around sponsored genetic testing programs specifically before we dive into some of our case studies. As you heard Michelle mention, when we think about setting up a sponsored genetic testing program, it really is keeping the provider and the patient relationship at the central. But we recognize there's a couple of different methods by which we can approach this. The goal of any sponsored genetic testing program is obviously to accelerate and increase equitable access to clinical trial opportunities for patients. And this really relies on us not only increasing awareness within patients, but also providers. And so there's a couple of different avenues by which we can build these sponsored genetic testing programs. One of which is patient-driven. So really the onus is on the patient. We're focusing on kind of education and awareness and engagement of that unique patient population and patient community for them to be able to self-schedule, access information, and really have test order and pre and post-test genetic counseling all occur within the walls of Genome Medical. We can also pursue a provider-driven method where we have the MD within the patient community or that patient organization order sponsored genetic testing, and then genetic counseling is performed with the Genome Medical team. And then lastly, we can do kind of a lighter lift from the provider standpoint and do a provider offered program where really it's the provider that's providing the educational, the discussion around the opportunities, and then passing that information off to the patient. And so it really comes down to the unique needs of our pharmaceutical partners in which one of these paths, or the multitude of paths, that would work best for their trial or their patient population that they're working with. And why is this, I think, so important? I want to say, there's clear utility and some growing body of evidence right now in the literature showing the unique value of sponsored genetic testing programs. And again, the goal is really identifying an increased number of patients that would meet eligibility, but also building this trial-ready population. So this is a great publication from just a couple of years ago, really looking at kind of the unique value of identifying or building a sponsored genetic testing program and how that led to increased genetic testing access for that patient population. So this was actually a really lovely kind of pre and post-test launch study design where they looked at one single academic institution looking at an eye clinic referral rate. And so you can see with the purple arrow in the middle, month 12, they really measured patient access to genetic testing prior to the launch of a no-cost research registry testing program. Once that was launched in their clinic, they then measured the access that patients had and the uptake of genetic testing in their clinic. Not surprisingly, because obviously we removed a barrier, which was financial, related to access to genetic testing, they saw a very significant increase in genetic test utilization from their patient population, nearly 29% post-program launch. But what I think is more telling is really looking at, the numbers of patients that this directly impacted in terms of patients that were then found to be eligible for research studies, clinical trials, two of which were also treated with an approved gene therapy following the testing. So I think this is a great example. Again, it's just one single referral site experience, but really shows the direct impact that sponsored genetic testing programs can play in really kind of equaling the playing field for access to genetic testing for certain patient populations. And why is this so important? We know that sponsored genetic testing programs, as we mentioned before, because they're removing a financial barrier often, that can increase the amount of patients you're identifying right away and access to genetic testing. But that certainly doesn't solve all of the barriers that we know a lot of our organizations are really struggling with as it relates to patient identification, recruitment, and then retention. So statistics that are probably not unfamiliar to those of you on the call: 50% of clinical trials sites fail to reach their enrollment targets. This is a big, big challenge right now. And it's not just around identifying patients, but it's also around really keeping those patients engaged and retained in the process. Qualified statistics that we've seen, when we just think about patient identification for many of these rare or ultra rare disorders, we're talking about very small patient populations with a very low disease prevalence. So you're starting off in a really challenging aspect. From a physician awareness standpoint, we know physicians play a very critical role in patients accessing and understanding what their clinical trial opportunities are. If patients aren't educated and aren't aware of these opportunities, those aren't going to get trickled down to patients. When it comes to actually recruiting and enrolling patients, we do see a lot of challenges with enrolling patients that really represent the community that they serve, especially when it comes to racial and ethnic minorities. A lot of well-documented challenges in really recruiting patients to represent what we see in that community. And much of that is because there is this inherent lack of trust and fear in the clinical trial process. So patients really struggle with making the right decision about whether or not this could be the right opportunity for them or not. And then lastly, when it comes to really retaining patients, it's not just about identifying those patients and enrolling them in that clinical trial. It's really around thinking about how to keep them engaged throughout the process so that they don't leave that clinical study. And we typically see on average 20 to 25% of patients actually decide to leave a study after they've been initially recruited in. And part of this is because there can be just really poor patient communication strategy. You might think about all of their patient communication and education materials up front, but forget that patients need to understand what's happening with that clinical trial and feel a part of that program throughout. And then when it comes to really the study design, we know that there can be very challenging and complex study designs, especially when you layer on potentially a gene or cell therapy. And so the study protocol schedule, the geographic distance that patients might have to travel can really be challenging to this patient population. And this can lead to poor retention in clinical trials. So one area that we've seen really help initially around clinical trial enrollment and recruitment is around really leveling the playing field as it relates to geographic access. This is really where telegenetic services like Genomedical can play a role. So this picture really depicts a spatial distribution of genetic counselors that are currently practicing in the US. Not surprisingly, you can see that even though our profession is growing, there is still mainly distribution of genetic counseling groups in metropolitan areas located in major cities. And so what you can see here is there's really wide swaths of the country where patients have very minimal access to genetic professionals. They would have to drive hours. And this can be a really limiting barrier to not just access to genetic services, but access to potential clinical trials that are dependent on a known molecular diagnosis. So by allowing telegenetics to play a role in access to testing and discussion of clinical trials, this can really help us reach patients who historically have been underrepresented for quite some time. And why is this so important? Like we mentioned, there are known, well-documented disparities in underrepresented patient communities specific to access to clinical trials. At this point, we know maybe only 25% of global clinical trial participants are of people of color. And the reason why this is so critical for us to discuss and address is because if we don't see that population represented in a clinical trial, this results in interventions and therapeutics that aren't effectively tested in these diverse populations. This can then lead to treatments that are less effective and therefore less trusted in those populations. There have been several examples of this been documented in the last couple of years, couple within the African American community, looking at specific chemotherapy drugs that weren't effectively targeted in that patient population, and there were specific side effects that weren't identified in the clinical trial because they had a low percentage of African American patients. And then other studies looking at clinical trials studying therapeutics for multiple myeloma. We know that this typically impacts the African American population at a higher frequency than the white population. Yet, historically, there have been a smaller percentage of those patient populations, including in the clinical trials. So we show this really to emphasize the fact that these are disparities that need to be discussed and addressed. Telegenetics is one way we can help address these by really reducing that geographic barrier and potential financial barrier for patients who may have to travel long distances or pay out of pocket for these services. One of the reasons many of you on this call may have been talking more about your own company's diversity plans is because of the specific FDA diversity requirements that have recently been announced. So under the FDA, we know that clinical trial sponsors now must submit a diversity action plan for certain late-stage drug trials. So this action plan needs to be specific. Not only will it include the goals for enrollment, but also the rationale and an explanation of how those sponsors will intend to meet them. And the April 2022 draft guidance that many of you are probably well aware of does provide a nice framework of the elements to include. So something we highlight, because this is a conversation we have with much of our biopharma sponsors and partners of how our services can help them potentially meet some of these FDA diversity requirements and reach a broader swath of patients that may historically have not been represented in past studies. So I'll pass it over to Michelle to dive into some of the most exciting content today, which is really some of our case studies.
Thanks, Molly. I hope that we've set you up well to really understand some of the unique elements of these case studies that we will share. So this first one is a partnership that we engaged in back in 2019 to start with a leader in gene-targeted therapeutics. They wanted to enhance the patient experience and broaden identification for individuals who might be eligible for a clinical trial. And so they recognized that they needed genetics expertise in this rare disease because of its newness and some of the sort of nuances of the genetic testing that were expected to be playing out. So they needed support in developing their program, including patient materials, healthcare provider materials, and the like. They wanted to support physicians and patients by offering genetic counseling as a part of their sponsored testing program. And they also really wanted to set up additional ancillary support services for the patients that were participating. And so Genome Medical was able to come in to deliver the clinical expertise in this rare disease space to help prepare the materials and services for the genetic counseling and the sponsored testing program. We provide pre and post-test genetic counseling. You'll hear us use those terms. Pre-test refers to education and information about the genetic testing that is going to be done, and then post-test refers to discussing the results. We also have provided call center support and webinars and additional education materials. We have a workflow for supporting relatives for testing to determine if they inherited the variant identified in their family member. And we have an integrated referral process that allows us to kind of seamlessly weave in the genetic counseling option along with the test ordering. So since the program launched, we have delivered over 8,000 genetic counseling sessions. We are actually supporting 3 different sponsored testing programs with a plan to launch genetic counseling support for 2 more. And this is providing care to patients in both the US and Canada. So if we dive into a bit of the data, you can see here that the program was launched in mid-2019, and we quickly scaled to over 2,000 consults per year since then, with a mix of both pre and post-test genetic counseling appointments. And I think the numbers certainly show our ability to scale and support a large number of patients. The quotes of the patient experience, though, really warm my heart. One patient said, "I'm extremely grateful for the way the genetic counselor held my hand and explained everything to me, what the test results meant, and knowing what to do next concerning my son. He was my biggest concern." Another patient shared that my experience was wonderful. The genetic counselor provided space for me to understand and ask questions. This service has been the highlight that really changed things for me. And so what I think these quotes demonstrate is that unique value we spoke about a few minutes ago that is brought to the sponsored program by the genetic counseling. One other thing that I think is important to highlight about this partnership is that for one of the sponsored testing programs, we recognized that there was an access gap, as Molly had mentioned. And so this map looks different from the one she showed a few slides back, because this is showing where the patients are located for the genetic counseling sessions. And what you can see, if you'll recall, that there were large regions of the country, particularly in the South, Southeast, and Southwest, where there's very limited access to genetic counseling. So what we're showing here is that actually this partnership has been able to deliver genetic counseling to patients who are in those areas that we would perhaps refer to as a genetic counseling desert, in other words, where access is significantly limited. We also know that this program is actually reaching patients of quite varied and diverse backgrounds. And even if you look at the distribution of ethnicities in these states, that probably would make sense to you. So we're helping to improve access to underserved communities. And so now I'll switch gears to share another case study that has a little bit different flavor to it. This program was built to support a sponsored genetic testing program for a primary immune deficiency. And the client recognized that they needed genetic counseling support to increase the utilization of the testing program as a way of kind of casting a wider net and really trying to identify patients that maybe aren't accessing genetic counseling and testing services otherwise. So they knew that they needed to increase physician comfort in ordering the testing by incorporating the genetic counseling services. They wanted to support patient care, especially because this is a set of providers that historically haven't really had much experience or exposure to genetic testing and interpretation of genetic test results. And they really wanted to ensure that their program was expanding its reach into community hospitals outside of major research or academic medical institutions. So through our collaboration, we've delivered pre and post-test genetic counseling services. Each patient and provider gets a summary report to kind of distill down the key points of their results. we have, again, this integrated referral process with the lab that the sponsor chose. And we also have used some tech touches, including white labeling and a text to schedule mechanism that really helps patients seamlessly and easily access the services. So over a little bit over a year and a half of the program, we've delivered more than 1,000 genetic counseling sessions across over 400 different referring providers in all 50 states. And if you look at kind of how the genetic counseling sessions have grown over time, you can see here that it was really a small number to start. And over the course of about a year, we were able to grow the genetic counseling volumes to close to 300 sessions per quarter. Keeping in mind, this is a very rare set of disease states. So we're not going to see the thousands like we might in a more common disease state. But I'm also pleased that we've been able to sort of maintain this volume over the last several quarters. And then, as Molly mentioned at the beginning, really our goal and focus here is the patient experience. So we pulled a couple of these quotes just to emphasize that what patients are saying. I was very impressed with the overall experience. The results came in a timely manner, and we set up the review session for a few days later. Easy. I was extremely impressed with the genetic counselor's insight, compassion, and understanding. I will pass on the company for my friends and family as a reliable source to contact for genetic testing and counseling. So I hope these case studies have kind of given you a window into some of the services that we've been providing in the biopharma space as a way to increase patient identification, access, and engagement. And I'll turn it back over to Molly to talk about some best practices for incorporating our services.
All right, thanks, Michelle. I agree. I hope everyone thought those case studies were helpful in terms of providing, I think, some tangible examples of how we've been able to work with our partners and the types of numbers and patient communities that we've been able to support. Like Michelle mentioned, I think one of the things that we have learned a lot with our biopharma partners and the work that we've done in sponsored genetic testing programs is to really understand how do we leverage kind of evidence-based best practices when we think about working with partners and developing a program from start to finish. So really just to highlight a lot of the space that our team really pays close attention to is really understanding how do we leverage evidence-based guidelines, best practices, work with patient communities to understand how to build programs that resonate with patients, with the community, and with the healthcare provider. So when we approach work with one of our partners related to a sponsored testing program, it's really just not focused on the actual logistics of how we get patients in the door, how we see them, and how we get out the door. It's really thinking uniquely about what does that patient community need for them to feel engaged, build trust with us, build trust with the partner, but also on the back end, how do we support the healthcare providers so they also feel like they're a part of the program. So these are just some of the best practices that we really take to heart and we think about when we're working with patients, patient communities, and healthcare providers to develop a program that really resonates and will be effective. So one of the things that we have built within Genome Medical that Michelle alluded to previously is one of our service offerings is our genetic advisory services. So this is the team that I sit on that really encompasses a group of individuals that have pretty in-depth experience spanning from clinical research, industry, and different pharmaceutical companies. And so we were really able to come in and work closely with Michelle's team and our clinical team to think about how do we build programs from the beginning. So some of the work that our team can do is come in and really work with partners much earlier in the phase. So whether or not they might need to support thinking about patient eligibility requirements, development of patient and provider educational materials, an engagement strategy with patient communities, things that really will set up their program for success. And so what this has led us to have is a really nice understanding of how genetic services can be uniquely positioned to help our pharmaceutical companies accelerate the work that they're doing as it relates to patient identification and recruitment. So as you can see, we have, again, a very simplistic schematic of where you might be thinking about in terms of your biopharmaceutical organization, and where some of our services have really provided value to our patients. So as you can see kind of on the top, as Michelle alluded to, we have substantial expertise in providing pre and post-test genetic counseling support for, at this point, over 24 individual sponsored genetic testing programs. But what this has also led to is experience kind of upstream and downstream from the sponsored genetic testing programs. Work we've done to really partner upfront on developing an IRB protocol, informed consent materials, and other educational materials that might be important for our sponsors to understand, especially if genetic testing and counseling is a requirement in a clinical trial or it's an option. And then we've also worked with partners really launching up to post-market and commercialization, who need genetics expertise in reviewing genetic test results that may be critical to patient eligibility in a new therapeutic. So this really highlights, I think, again, how we've worked with our pharmaceutical partners, what we've learned over time, and we're excited to launch into some of the discussion with you today and answer some questions. So really, in conclusion, I hope you're leaving today taking home the fact that genomics will and continue to play a larger role in facilitating patient access to therapeutics. More and more therapeutics are disease specific and really require access to an accurate molecular diagnosis prior to clinical trial enrollment. Sponsored genetic testing programs can be of value to shortening the diagnostic odyssey, but really providing equitable access to patients who may not have access to genetic services based on their geographic location. And then genetic counseling services. Not only do genetic counselors provide and support patients through the diagnosis of a genetic condition, but they really can provide key information in helping patients decide whether or not they might be interested in clinical trial opportunities and help them push towards patient and community support systems. And lastly, telehealth services. As Michelle mentioned, we've seen an increased trust in the use of telehealth post-COVID, and we're continuing to see the value that telehealth services play, specifically related to access to clinical trials and approved therapeutics. So with that, we'll kind of end. We really appreciate the time that you've spent with us today, and we look forward to jumping into some questions from the audience.
Great. Molly and Michelle, thank you so much for that great presentation. In the few minutes that we have left, we're going to get through as many of these questions as we can. Our first one says, I only need 50 people for my clinical trial. Does it make sense to offer a sponsored testing program for such a small patient volume?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things we talked about, in the presentation is sometimes those numbers can be really deceiving. You might think, gosh, 50 patients, it might be quite easy to get that based on what we're anticipating of the disease population and what we know in terms of relationships we have with that patient community. Ultimately, I think it comes down to our pharmaceutical partners really understanding what is the timeline that they need to access these patients. So we've seen a lot of our sponsored testing programs work with us, and they only need small numbers, but there is significant value if they're able to identify, recruit, and engage those patients faster. That really speeds up the whole pipeline. So I think we're welcome to have conversations. We have experience with diseases that are completely ultra rare to diseases that are much more common, all of which come with their own challenges, right, and unique opportunities to identification. But access is a gap. Geographic access to genetic services, as we mentioned, is a known gap. So it can certainly be helpful even if overall patient numbers that you're looking to engage with can be small.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question asks, we need to recruit a diverse patient population for our study. How can telegenetics help with that?
Yeah, so I'll kind of jump in here, and Michelle, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think, like we've seen that map, the genetics community and access to genetic services is growing, but geographic access is a real limiting barrier to many patient communities. So when we see the fact that most clinical trials are really centered in a large metropolitan academic medical center, where those patient populations are able to take time off from work, have childcare, spend time and money to get to those appointments, that can be a real limiting barrier to a lot of patients. And so while telegenetics doesn't remove all of the known barriers and challenges that we know face accessing a diverse patient population, it can certainly remove that initial phase and actually help you get that first step of engagement with the patient. So I think that's a really critical way for us to think about. We've also seen really clear evidence of the interest in the acceptability of telehealth post-COVID. And so I think that's a great opportunity for our sponsors to think about. This may be one key way to engage with patient populations and get access to new patients that may be underserved.
Yeah, and the other thing that I might highlight that I don't think we spent much time on is that we hear that for academic medical centers and large institutions, sometimes there can be a wait time of 2 to 6 months to be seen for a genetic counseling appointment. And so one of the things that we've really tried to maximize is very short wait times. Most patients who are referred to Genome Medical get their genetic counseling session within 3 days and almost always within a week of the referral. So that kind of short turnaround from referral to appointment, I think really supports patients who, have a lot going on and might not be able to carve out time in 3 months for the only appointment they could get.
Yeah, I'll add on. I think that's a great point, Michelle, when we think about that funnel, right, of patients being identified, recruited and engaged into a trial, really being able to focus on kind of immediacy right away. If they're interested, they're engaged, we want to keep that momentum up. And you're right, a significant wait time or challenge or drive to a center might just be kind of that straw that breaks their back and makes them decide not to participate. So I think that's a great point around that turnaround time that we can support.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question says, we have unique needs. How have you seen genetic services used with other biopharma companies? Is there flexibility to fit our specific needs?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll start here. What I've realized in my work collaborating with many of the programs that you've heard about today, as well as additional ones that we didn't cover, is that every sponsored program and clinical trial has unique needs, and we really strive to find ways to deliver solutions that meet those needs. So, part of my role as a clinical science liaison in establishing new partners is to listen to what some of the issues are and what some of the challenges and barriers have been, as well as understanding the clinical nature of the condition and the patient experience, and sort of blending all those things to create services that are delivered in a way that are going to meet those needs. So this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution that we offer. And in fact, we invest a lot of time and energy in considering what are the unique elements of that particular condition and testing strategy in order to tailor a program that is going to meet those patients' needs. And in fact, once a program is launched, we have the ability to collect data through surveys and from our clinical genetic counseling team. And so we've actually gone back to certain programs and evolved them over the course of time to continue to improve and scale them.
Excellent. Thank you. We have just under 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question before we close. Due to the nature of rare disease, many clinical trials need to be international in terms of footprint. Can you provide GC services internationally?
We get this question a lot, so I'm glad we're squeezing this one in. We are able to provide genetic counseling services in the US and Canada. Outside of those locations, each country has its own set of regulations. Some countries have much more stringent rules than others. And so we listen to the needs and we try to assess if we're able to deliver services and in what way. One of the places that we've kind of seen this be feasible is using some of our technology tools. So educational videos and other tech-delivered solutions that can provide education to patients, even if they are physically located in a part of the world where the legal and other regulations don't allow us to provide one-on-one genetic counseling services.
Perfect. Thank you. That does it for us on time for today. I would like to thank our speakers, Molly McGinnis and Michelle Hearn, for a great discussion today. We appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise with us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. If you asked a question that we did not get to, someone will respond to you by email. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.